The knock on the bridal suite door came like a gentle tap on glass, polite, careful, meant not to startle. I was standing at the window veil draped across my forearm, watching sunlight pour down the hotel's stone courtyard. My phone buzzed once on the vanity and slid a few inches, the screen lighting my bouquet in a cool blue glow. I told myself it was my mother running late asking where to park. I told myself a lot of things as the room hummed with hairspray, soft laughter, and the muffled zip of garment bags. I picked up the phone and opened the message. A photo filled the screen, a white yacht on a sheet of blue water bodies flung lazily across sun-warmed cushions. My parents, my siblings, my cousins. Sunglasses champagne ocean behind them, the green ribs of Maui rising in the distance. The caption didn't bother with punctuation, just 4 words that landed like a verdict, peace family. No distractions. Someone said my name. The wall clock ticked. A curl of steam rose from a paper cup of coffee and dissolved. I stood perfectly still, like a figure in a painting, staring at the seats they had chosen. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever learned the truth at the worst possible time, hit that like button and subscribe. These stories help more people find their footing when the floor gives way. To understand how that photo cracked something old and hidden, you need to know the shape of the life that held it. I'm Natalie. I pay my bills on time. I return grocery carts to the corral. I became a financial advisor because numbers don't lie, and God knows I've spent enough years translating other people's evasions into something you can build a life on. I was the kid who remembered permission slips, cooked dinner when my parents worked late, and made sure my brother and sister found their jackets in winter. If love had a ledger, I kept it balanced for everyone but me. My father, Harold, calls it practicality. He likes clean lists and quiet rooms, especially when other people are doing the work of keeping them clean and quiet. My mother, Diana, prefers the softer kind of control. We'll do our best. Dear the kind that leaves you saying thank you for very little. Zach, 4 years younger, harvests second chances the way some boys collect baseball cards. Amy, the youngest, has a smile that opens doors and a memory that loses promises on purpose. 5 years ago, when my grandparents passed, the lawyer slid a document across a heavy oak table and read a single line that bent heads. I was trustee of the family emergency fund. Natalie is the only one with enough sense to manage it properly. My grandmother had written in looping blue ink. $300,000, not for vacations or upgrades, but for emergencies, real ones. I took it like a baptism and an anvil. I paid my father's hospital copay for heart surgery that scared us all awake for 1 week. I kept Amy in her apartment during a stretch of bad luck and worse decisions. I replaced Zach's car after an accident left him unhurt, and the frame twisted. Every time I asked for a little formality receipts, a plan, a timeline. Every time I learned how quickly a family can confuse boundaries for cruelty. The morning of our wedding was the kind of June day postcards try to imitate. Sunlight spilled across the hotel carpet in pale rectangles. Samantha, my best friend, moved through the suite like a conductor, quiet hands, gentle cues, everything somehow already done before I knew it needed doing. Brushes tapped the rims of glass jars. The photographer laid lace across the back of a chair and said, "Turn your head just slightly perfect." It smelled faintly of peonies and coffee and the clean starch of new clothes. "Has your mom texted Samantha?" asked, tying a ribbon and not looking at me too directly. "They know the schedule," I said, and the sentence felt like a fence held in place by hope and habit. 6 times I tried my mother's phone, straight to voicemail. 3 times I tried my father's. Rings, then silence. Amy's reply came like a shrug typed with thumbs, super busy, we'll try to check later. Zach's phone wasn't accepting calls. At 9:11 a.m., my screen flashed with a new message from my mother. "We will not make it. Do not take it personally." The first thing I did was laugh, just one short sound like you do when a word lands so far from its meaning it becomes absurd. I handed my phone to Samantha because saying it out loud would make it happen again. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and I watched her eyes turn from hazel to glassy. Kate, my soon-to-be sister-in-law, took both my hands. "We're here," she said, and I believed her because she already had been. There's a specific kind of quiet that follows a door you thought would open and doesn't. It isn't peace. It's the sound of rearranging. The photographer changed shot lists on the fly. No mother buttoning a collar. No sister leaning close to fix lipstick. No father's hands that look like your grandfather's offering an arm. Thomas, my future father-in-law, asked if he could do the honors of walking with me. Laura dusted a speck of powder from my cheek and pressed her palm to my shoulder a second longer than necessary. The kindness helped and also hurt the way warm water finds a crack in a glass. We started the ceremony right on time. The quartet found the first notes we'd chosen months ago at our kitchen table. I walked down the aisle on Thomas's arm, feeling the weight of his steadiness and the feather-light ache of the two empty chairs in the front row. James looked at me like a man in a doorway, watching the sun come up, and I took a breath that reached the bottom of my lungs. We said words about showing up, about health and sickness, about building a small shelter that could stand a hard wind. When the officiant pronounced us, James's hands tightened around mine in a way that said the quiet part, I see it. I see you. I'm not going anywhere. At cocktail hour, glassware chimed against trays. Someone's laugh rolled across the terrace and broke into smaller pieces. I let myself scan the entry twice, then a third time, as if willpower could conjure a family in their better clothes. "They're not coming," James said softly, standing just close enough that I could feel the heat of his arm. "And that is their loss." I told him I knew. Knowing hurts less than hoping it's a cleaner cut. We took our first spin across the dance floor, like people who had practiced in a living room, knocking into furniture and laughing. Thomas and I shared a simple waltz where he said, "I've got you, kiddo," and meant it all the way down. Halfway through the reception, I checked my phone again, out of habit, not hope. That's when the photo arrived, sent by Uncle Frank. No message, just the image time-stamped and bright with salt and sky. My eyes caught first on my mother's sunglasses, then on Amy's bare feet, then on my father's ring hand closing around a drink. In the background, those mountains I once saw on postcards in the grocery store line Maui, where James and I plan to go next month because work schedules don't bend just because Joy asks them to. The caption sat under it like a calm command, "Peace, family." No distractions. The word distractions is interesting. It suggests noise and interruption, something trivial that pulls you away from what matters. It suggests my wedding invitations addressed menus, selected vows practiced in a parked car, was a speed bump on their route to a good day. I stepped into a service corridor where the lights were flatter and the floor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old water. I pressed my back to a cool wall slide, laughed once without sound, then felt my face fold. It wasn't the kind of crying that takes over. It was quiet and neat, like pouring a cup of water down a drain. James found me there because he knows my patterns the way I know the shape of his hands. I handed him the phone, and I watched the knowledge move across his face. Confusion, then heat, then something cold and still. The bank app blinked a push notification. I tapped without thinking, like muscle memory. A withdrawal, $22,000, approved 3 weeks earlier. The memo line read, "Specialized physical therapy not covered by insurance." The payee wasn't a clinic. It was a travel agency that specializes in luxury Hawaiian vacations. Numbers do not lie. They don't know how. My throat tightened in that careful, warning way, as if my own body was cupping my voice and saying, "Hold steady." I thought about a cake tasting where I sat alone and sampled creams with names that sounded like weather. I thought about a text thread where my sister tried on a single dress and vanished from the conversation like a coin dropped in grass. I thought about my father's vague promise to figure out the walk closer to the date, and how my mother, even then, must have known there would be no walk, only water. At the sweetheart table, there were 2 chairs, and for a moment, we didn't sit. I could hear the quartet through the wall, another set beginning, another song about forever. I started to say, maybe we should cut the night short, but James shook his head once, gentle and firm. "We won't give them that," he said. "We'll finish the night with the people who came." So I went back out. I cut a cake with a man who meant every word he said in front of God and family and flowers. I smiled for photos that will live in frames on other people's mantles. I hugged friends who took the time, wrote notes by hand, and held doors. It looked like a perfect day to anyone who wasn't holding my phone. Injustice doesn't always kick the door. Sometimes it sends a photo and writes 4 clean words beneath it. Sometimes it lets the band play while you stand very still and feel your own center tilt by a degree you can only measure later. When the last song slowed and the terrace lights dimmed, someone tossed blush pink petals that caught in my hair and slid down the back of my dress. We walked through that soft storm and into night air that smelled like cut grass and a coming storm. In the parking lot, James opened the car door and waited a beat, just looking at me the way you study a sky before rain. I didn't cry again. I didn't speak. I buckled my seatbelt with hands that had finally steadied. On the ride home, the wipers squeaked across a windshield that didn't need them yet. The city lights flickered past in quiet rows, like a clock counting down. In my lap, the phone lay face down, warm from my palm. I stared at the dark screen and felt the first hard edge of something I had never let myself touch. By the time we pulled under our porch light, a plan had taken its first breath, not loud, not angry, simply alive. I stepped inside, set my bouquet in the kitchen sink, and reached for my phone. I had spent years keeping the ledger clean for everyone else. It was time to draw a line for me. James carried my shoes inside while I stood in the doorway, still holding my phone. The house felt quieter than usual, like the walls were waiting for something I hadn't yet said out loud. The kitchen light pooled across the counter, catching the silver wrap on my bouquet where I had set it earlier. I ran a fingertip along the petals. They were already starting to wilt at the edges. He came up behind me, hands on my shoulders, steady as always. We didn't talk for a long time. The sound of the refrigerator motor filled the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. "We'll figure out what to do, Nat. Not tonight. But we will." I nodded. I wasn't sure if he meant what to do about the photo or about my family in general. Maybe he didn't know either. The next morning, sunlight cut through the curtains in long stripes across our bed. My phone buzzed again, one unread message from Amy. It wasn't an apology. Just 3 words. "Hope the wedding went okay." I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then I placed it face down on the nightstand and got dressed. We were supposed to leave for Hawaii in a few weeks, our delayed honeymoon, but the irony of that plan sat in my stomach like a stone. For now, we went to the brunch James's parents were hosting. Laura greeted me at the door with a hug that felt like the kind you remember later, warm, certain no conditions attached. She said, "Whatever's going on, you're family now." I nearly lost my composure right there in her kitchen, surrounded by the smell of bacon and cinnamon coffee. I smiled through it, thanked her, and tried to look like a woman who had simply gotten tired, not one who'd been quietly gutted. Everyone talked about the ceremony, about the light coming through the windows, and the way the quartet hit the last note. I nodded, poured orange juice and listened. Inside, the same question kept circling back. How could people who raised you decide you were optional? By the time we drove home that afternoon, the sadness had cooled into something sharper. I opened my laptop and pulled up the emergency fund records. The numbers lined up neatly, date by date, every transfer recorded. My father's withdrawal 3 weeks earlier stood out like a bruise. The documentation attached to it claimed physical therapy payments for my mother, complete with a forged invoice. I clicked through the transaction trail until the destination appeared a travel agency in Honolulu. James looked over my shoulder and exhaled through his teeth. They used it for the trip, he said. They didn't even try to hide it. It wasn't surprise that hit me. It was recognition. Like walking into a room you've been in before and finally seeing all the details you ignored. I scrolled further, searching for older withdrawals, cross-checking the explanations I had once accepted. A small voice inside me began listing the patterns, the last-minute excuses, the careful half-truths, the way guilt had been their currency and I had been their bank. I thought about calling my mother, but I knew how that would go. She'd sigh, say I was overreacting, shift blame like she always had. Instead, I called my best friend Samantha. She answered on the second ring. I didn't even have to explain. She said, "They did something again, didn't they?" I told her everything. The photo, the forged request, the months of pretending. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried that mix of anger and loyalty that only comes from someone who's seen you hurt too many times. "Natalie, this isn't new. This is just the loudest it's ever been." Her words stayed with me. The loudest it's ever been. That night, I booked an appointment with my therapist, Dr. Martinez, for the next morning. I needed to speak the truth in a room where someone wouldn't twist it back into my fault. Dr. Martinez listened while I laid out the facts, the wedding, the photo, the money. When I ran out of sentences, she leaned back in her chair and said, "What you're feeling now isn't just grief. It's the shock of finally seeing a pattern without the hope that used to soften it." She told me I had spent years trying to earn love that should have been given freely. "When you stop chasing it, the silence feels like loss," she said, "but it's actually the beginning of peace." I wanted to believe her, but peace sounded too calm for what lived inside me. What I felt was a slow burn, anger, layered over disbelief, thickened by years of keeping the peace for people who never returned it. That evening, I sat with James at the kitchen table, the fund documents spread out between us. He traced his finger along one column of numbers. "You could shut it down," he said quietly. "Cut them off from this completely." I looked at the balance. The money wasn't mine, not really, but the responsibility had been. My grandmother's handwriting still sat on the scanned copy of her will, a single note beside my name. "She'll know what to do." I thought of that line, often wondering what she had seen in me that I hadn't yet recognized. "I'll revoke their access for now," I said. "But I want to do it right legally, not out of anger." Over the next 2 days, I moved through life like someone carrying two versions of herself. On the surface, I went to work, smiled at clients, answered emails. Beneath that, I was untangling years of stories I'd believed about my family. I printed every record, highlighted every withdrawal, created a timeline of lies so I could no longer pretend it was all misunderstanding. By Thursday, the messages started. First, a text from Zach. "Dad says we can't get to the emergency money. Fix it." Then another. "You're acting like a dictator." Amy followed with her own, accusing me of punishing everyone for a small mistake. My mother's message came late that night. "We had a family obligation you wouldn't understand." This reaction is uncalled for. None of them asked how I was. None mentioned missing the wedding. It was all about access. James suggested we upgrade our locks and install security cameras. I didn't argue. When my father's first voicemail arrived, filled with sharp edges and threats about consequences, I saved it. The second, I forwarded to our lawyer. Dr. Martinez told me this was the part that would feel hardest, the space between setting boundaries and the calm that follows. They'll push, she said. They always have. The question is whether you'll still open the door when they do. Friday morning, I met with Gerald Hoffman, the family attorney who had once handled my grandparents' estate. His office smelled faintly of paper and lemon oil, a scent that somehow steadied me. I told him everything, what had happened, the false documentation, the messages that followed. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making a note. "Your grandmother suspected this might happen," he said finally. "That's why she wrote such broad authority into the trust. You have full discretion. You can restrict access, require proof, or dissolve the fund entirely if it's being abused." He looked over his glasses. "Do you want to end it?" I thought about the years of withdrawals that had never been repaid, the way every conversation with my parents circled back to what they needed. Ending it felt final. Too final. But leaving it open felt like waiting for another wound. "Not yet," I said. "But I want rules, real ones. Verification receipts, direct payments. No more trust on credit." We spent hours drafting new conditions. By the time I left his office, the sun had shifted low enough to warm the marble floor in long bands of gold. I felt lighter than I had in months, maybe years. Not happy, but steady. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the air soft with early summer. James came out and sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. The crickets were loud enough to fill the silence. Finally, he said, "You did the right thing." "I hope so," I murmured. He reached for my hand. "You don't have to hope. You did." Across the street porch, lights blinked on one by one, a quiet pattern of people settling in. I thought about my mother's voice, the way she could make a sentence sound like a verdict. I thought about my father's pride and how easily it curdled into anger. For the first time, I didn't feel small when I thought of them. I just felt tired and free. Still, I knew the silence wouldn't last. People who lose control rarely walk away quietly. They come knocking, sometimes with smiles, sometimes with threats, sometimes with both. That night, I printed one more copy of the new agreement and set it on the entry table beside the front door. The porch light burned steady through the glass. If anyone came asking, I wanted the truth ready in writing before the noise began. The next morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway and the faint buzz of the doorbell. James was already up. I heard him pause at the window, then his voice tense, quiet. "Natalie," he said, "your dad's here." The air in the room changed, thickened somehow. I slipped out of bed, pulled on a robe, and took one long breath that didn't quite fill my chest. The new locks gleamed in the morning light. Somewhere outside, my father pressed the bell again. I stood still, heart pounding in a rhythm that was both fear and something close to relief. The moment had finally come. After years of silence, of compromise, of believing peace meant swallowing pain, I was done hiding behind courtesy. I reached for the folder on the table and felt its weight in my hands, $300,000 worth of proof that I had done everything right. Then I walked toward the door, the sound of my father's voice already rising on the other side. Through the peephole, my father's face filled the glass, flushed jaw tight, eyes narrowed with the kind of anger that doesn't need words. His finger pressed the doorbell again, then again, quick and impatient. Behind him, morning light spilled down the hallway, touching the edge of his shoes. I could smell the faint trace of rain from the open stairwell window. I kept the security chain latched and opened the door just a few inches. My voice came out steady, though my heart wasn't. "It isn't a good time, Dad." He pushed closer, close enough for the smell of his aftershave to drift in. "Not a good time." "It hasn't been a good time since you started this nonsense with the fund. You're going to fix it today." He'd always led with volume, not reason. When I was little, that voice could fill a house, and everyone fell silent. Now it only made me tired. I told him the truth as simply as I could, that the account had new rules, that I wouldn't undo them. His voice rose, echoing down the hall. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Your mother and sister are still stuck in Maui because the hotel won't release them until the bill's paid. You made a mess out of everything." I thought of that photo again. The sunlight, the glasses raised, the laughter that had been louder than my vows. I met his eyes through the small gap in the door. "That's unfortunate," I said, "but using a medical claim to pay for a vacation has consequences." For a second, he blinked, caught off guard by the word. Consequences. He wasn't used to hearing it from me. He rattled the chain, his face close enough for the metal to shudder between us. "You ungrateful little, after everything we've done for you." Across the hall, Mrs. Garcia's door opened. She was an older woman, retired, soft-voiced, but unafraid of noise. She paused when she saw him there, then stepped back into her apartment and left her door half open. It was enough to remind me that I wasn't alone in the building anymore. "You should go," I said. "I'll send you something to settle your hotel bill, and that's all." He frowned, confused. "Settle what?" "Wait here." I closed the door and walked to the entry table. The folder I'd prepared days earlier lay waiting. Inside was everything, records of every withdrawal, text messages, and a printed plane ticket. I returned to the door and slid the folder through the narrow opening. "What's this?" he asked. "Proof," I said. "Proof of every time I helped, every dollar I kept track of, every lie you told about needing help. And the last page is a gift. A one-way ticket back to Maui, and the hotel balance paid in full." His eyes flicked down the list, scanning the pages like a man who didn't recognize his own handwriting. "What is this supposed to mean?" "It means that's the last direct assistance you'll get from me. The emergency fund isn't your account anymore. It's over." He stared at me, the muscles in his jaw shifting, then looked past me toward the kitchen where James had just appeared. When he saw him, his voice turned sharp. "You put her up to this, didn't you?" James didn't raise his voice. "Natalie makes her own decisions." For a heartbeat, my father didn't know where to put his anger. He looked smaller somehow, still defiant, but unsteady. Then his expression changed, a flash of something like disbelief. "You can't dissolve that fund. That was your grandmother's money." "I already have," I said. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "The money's gone now. I continued to charities that help families like ours, families trying to build something better than manipulation. You always said it belonged to the family. It still does, just not the way you imagined." The hallway had gone quiet. Even the air seemed to wait. Behind him, the elevator doors opened, spilling a soft chime into the space. He didn't move. Finally, he muttered, "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." He took the folder, turned, and walked away. His footsteps echoed until the sound faded down the stairs. I didn't breathe until the door closed fully, and the chain slid free. James came over, rested his hands on my arms, and asked if I was okay. "No," I said. "But I will be." I meant it. For the first time in my life, I'd stood still while he shouted, and nothing inside me folded. The quiet that followed was heavy, but clean. Days passed without another knock. My phone stayed silent, though I caught myself checking it out of habit. When messages finally came, they arrived in a single burst, Amy pleading, Zach mocking my mother, trying to turn guilt into reason. None mentioned my wedding. Every word was about money control or disappointment. I read them once, then archived them all. That weekend, I drove to see Gerald again. His office smelled of the same old paper and polish comforting in its order. He asked if I was sure about the dissolution. I told him I was. We signed the last documents together, his pen scratching softly across the paper. He looked at me for a long moment afterward. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he said. "She trusted you to do what was right, not what was easy." Outside, the sky had turned gray, the kind that holds the promise of rain, but not the storm itself. I stood for a moment by my car, breathing in the smell of wet pavement. It felt like standing at the edge of something new, uncertain, but steady beneath my feet. That night, the first letter came. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, my mother's careful loops neat as pressed linen. I opened it slowly at the kitchen table. The stationery smelled faintly of her perfume. "I hope you are satisfied with the pain you've caused this family," she wrote. "Your father has not been the same since your cruel announcement. After all we sacrificed for you, this is how you repay our love. Perhaps someday you'll realize the damage you've done." There was no question about how I was, no mention of missing my wedding, just a familiar reminder of my supposed obligations. I folded it back into the envelope, placed it in a drawer, and sat for a long time staring at the window where the city lights reflected in the glass. When I showed the letter to Dr. Martinez during our next session, she asked what I noticed first. I told her the truth. It was the absence of curiosity. My mother had written 2 pages without a single word about me. Dr. Martinez smiled gently. "That's progress," she said. "Seeing what's missing is often the clearest sign you've stopped expecting it." By the end of the session, the heavy guilt I'd carried for years had thinned into something almost transparent. I still loved them, but from a distance, that felt safe. A week later, Amy appeared unannounced at my office. Our receptionist called ahead, her voice uncertain. "She said your sister seems upset. Should I tell her you're busy?" I hesitated before answering. "No, it's all right. I'll see her." Amy looked smaller than I remembered, eyes rimmed red, makeup uneven. She perched on the edge of the chair, like someone unsure whether to stay or flee. "Things have been awful at home since your wedding," she started. "Dad's angry all the time. Mom won't talk to anyone. I thought maybe we could find a way to make peace." I waited. She took a breath. "The boutique cut my hours. I'm behind on rent. I wouldn't ask, but with the fund gone." There it was. I told her gently that I couldn't help her financially anymore. Her mouth twisted. "We're family," she said. "Families help each other." "Families also show up," I replied. "Families celebrate each other's joy, not only their own needs." Her eyes hardened. "So that's it. One mistake, and we're all dead to you." "This wasn't one mistake, Amy. It was a lifetime of them. I wish you well, but I can't live like that anymore." She stood without another word and left the door closing softly behind her. I sat there afterward, my hands trembling, but the fear that used to follow moments like that never came. Only quiet resolve. That night, I called Laura and asked if James and I could come by for dinner. When we arrived, she hugged me as if she'd been waiting all week. She didn't ask for details, didn't press. She just set an extra plate on the table and passed me the bread basket like any other night. Later, as we left, she said, "You know, family doesn't have to be complicated. It can just be people showing up when they say they will." Her words lingered with me the whole drive home. Through the car window, the city lights blurred soft and distant, like something finally fading out of focus. When we pulled into the driveway, James reached over, took my hand, and smiled. "You look lighter," he said. I looked out at the porch light glowing against the dark. Maybe I was. For the first time in years, the silence in my life didn't feel empty. It felt like room to breathe, to build, to begin again. And though I didn't know what might come next, letters, calls, or the echo of their anger, I knew that whatever it was, I would meet it standing on my own 2 feet. The holidays arrived faster than I expected, but without the usual sense of urgency. For the first time, there was no family group text to navigate, no long chain of passive-aggressive reminders about who was bringing what dish. Our calendar looked strange with all that empty space, but when I stared at it, it didn't feel lonely. It just looked open. James suggested a trip someplace warm and quiet, but I told him I didn't want to run away from the silence. I wanted to live in it, so we stayed home. Thanksgiving came on a clear, cold morning. I woke early, brewed coffee, and watched sunlight stretch across the counter. We spent the day cooking turkey-roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, and filled the table with friends who had nowhere else to go. Samantha and her husband brought pie. Our neighbors stopped in with wine, and the house filled with easy conversation. There was laughter that reached every corner of the room, none of it forced. No one measured words or fought to be heard. When someone spilled cranberry sauce on the tablecloth, we all laughed, and nobody cared. That small imperfection felt almost sacred proof that warmth didn't need to be flawless. As I looked around the table, I realized it was the first holiday dinner where I didn't have to brace myself. Every voice that rose here came from choice, not obligation. When December came, Laura and Thomas invited us to spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with them. Their house always looked like it belonged in a snow globe, white lights on the porch garlands along the stair rail, the faint scent of cinnamon and pine. On Christmas morning, Laura handed me a small box wrapped in red paper. Inside was a silver bracelet with a single charm shaped like a key. She smiled and said softly, "A reminder that you've already opened the right door." That night, we sat near the fire, while Thomas told old stories about his first job and the years when money was tight. Every story ended with gratitude, not bitterness. Their kind of family felt quiet and solid, built from small daily promises kept over time. I thought about my own parents, how love had always been conditional, how generosity had turned into leverage. Sitting there in that living room, I understood what had been missing all along. The next week, Aunt Patricia called. Her voice was gentle, but it carried the kind of firmness that comes from having seen too much and learned to name it. "I've been meaning to reach out," she said. I didn't realize the wedding had already happened until someone mentioned the photos online. No one told me the date. I told her what had really happened, how they'd planned a trip instead of showing up, how they used the fund to pay for it. There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Then she exhaled. "I'm not surprised, but I'm still sorry. Your mother always cared more about how things looked than how people felt. I just didn't think she'd go this far. She promised to stay in touch and invited us for dinner sometime after the new year." When I hung up, the house was quiet, except for the hum of the heater. I felt an unfamiliar kind of relief, the knowledge that someone in the family finally knew the truth and didn't twist it into something else. A few days later, I received an email from Uncle Frank, the same uncle who'd sent that photo from the yacht. His message was short. He wrote that he hadn't realized I hadn't been told about the trip. "I thought you already knew," he said. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I never would have sent that picture if I'd known." He attached a photo of a quiet shoreline taken at sunset and ended the email with, "You did the right thing, Natalie. Some bridges are worth burning when they lead nowhere." I didn't respond right away. I just sat at my desk, watching that image on my screen, the horizon faint and soft, like a bruise healing over time. It felt like closure, the kind that doesn't require an audience. Winter passed, and spring arrived quietly. I began volunteering at a local community center, teaching financial literacy classes for young adults. It started as a small idea, but the satisfaction it brought me surprised me. For years, I had managed money to hold a family together. Now I was helping people build something for themselves. The difference was everything. Sometimes after class, I'd stop by Dr. Martinez's office. We'd talk about progress, the kind you don't notice until you look back. I told her how calm my life felt now. She smiled. Calm doesn't mean empty, she said. It means stable enough for new things to grow. Around that time, James came home with an idea. Next month will be our first anniversary, he said. What if we did it right this time? Small ceremony, just the people who truly showed up. The thought of it made me smile. I pictured a garden sunlight on linen, the quiet rustle of leaves instead of applause. A celebration built from presence, not pretense. We set the date for early June, almost a year to the day from the wedding that had taught me everything I needed to know. Samantha offered to help again, and Laura insisted on hosting the reception in her backyard. Invitations went out only to those who had stood by us, not out of exclusion, but gratitude. On the morning of the ceremony, the sky was clear and bright. The garden smelled of roses and damp earth from the night's rain. I wore a simple white dress that brushed my ankles, nothing ornate. As I stood at the edge of the aisle, Thomas smiled at me and asked if I wanted his arm again. I nodded. The music started soft and slow. This time, when I walked forward, every face I saw carried warmth. Samantha wiped a tear. Laura held James's mother's hand, and I could see the pride in James's eyes even before I reached him. The vows we spoke were shorter this time, but they carried more weight because they were spoken in truth, not shadowed by absence. Afterward, as the guests mingled among the garden lights, Aunt Patricia approached me. "Your grandmother would have been proud," she said. "She always believed you'd be the one to break the pattern." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't answer. She reached out and squeezed my hand. "You did it with grace," she said quietly. When the evening wound down, I stood near the edge of the lawn watching the light fade. Fireflies flickered in the grass, and laughter drifted across the air. For the first time, peace didn't feel like an idea. It felt like something I could touch. Later that night, James and I walked home hand in hand. The street was still, and the sound of our footsteps echoed against the pavement. He said, "Do you ever miss them?" I thought for a long moment before answering. Sometimes I miss what I thought we could be, but I don't miss who they were to me. He nodded, understanding, without another word. The porch light glowed ahead of us, steady and familiar. I unlocked the door, and for once, walking inside didn't feel like closing something behind me. It felt like opening the rest of my life. The days that followed were quiet, filled with routines that made sense: morning coffee on the porch, evening walks with James, the hum of a world that no longer tilted under someone else's weight. I received a few more letters from my family, though I didn't open them. Eventually, they stopped coming. I kept one envelope, though the last one my mother sent. It sits in a drawer by my desk, unopened. Not out of anger, but because I no longer need to read it to know what it says. Some words only take away peace, and I've worked too hard to keep mine. Sometimes I still think of that yacht photo, the sunlight, and careless smiles. I used to see it as the moment they chose each other over me. Now I see it differently. It was the moment life gave me permission to choose myself. The evening before our first anniversary, I stood at the window watching the last of the daylight fade across the yard. The air smelled like rain again, the same way it had the day everything changed. I thought of my grandmother's note in her will. She'll know what to do. It had taken a long road, but I finally did. And as the sky turned from gold to gray, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. The story that began with absence had found its ending in presence, quiet, steady, and mine. The last day of summer came soft and golden, the kind of evening that hums quietly under the skin. The garden outside our window was heavy with blooms, the air warm enough to hold their scent long after sunset. I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the shadows stretch across the yard. Everything around me felt still, no expectation, no tension, just space. James was inside, finishing up a call, his voice drifting faintly through the open window. I could hear him laugh, that low, easy sound that had once been the only thing strong enough to quiet my panic. Now, it just blended into the calm rhythm of home. I'd stopped counting how long it had been since I'd last heard from my family. Months, maybe more. The quiet had turned from foreign to familiar. At first, I kept waiting for the next storm, the late-night call, the unexpected letter, the attempt to twist the knife again. But nothing came. The silence had settled like a gentle fog, and I'd learned not to be afraid of it. Sometimes I still thought about them, not with anger anymore, just understanding. My father's temper, my mother's pride, my siblings' need to always find someone else to carry the blame. They were patterns, not mysteries. And when I looked at them that way, I finally saw how little any of it had to do with me. Dr. Martinez once told me that healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means walking through your own house with the lights on. I think that's what this piece is, the light I never let myself turn on before. When the mail arrived that evening, I brought it inside and sorted through the envelopes. Bills, catalogs, one card, with my aunt's familiar handwriting. She and I spoke often, now small check-ins that felt like care, not duty. She wrote about the tomatoes in her garden, about how her husband's health had improved, about the quiet joy of ordinary days. At the bottom of the card, she had written, "You did the hard part, sweetheart. The rest is just living." I placed the card on the kitchen counter and smiled. Living. Such a simple word, but it carried weight now. In the past year, James and I had built a rhythm that made sense. He'd open his laptop at the kitchen table, humming under his breath as he worked. I'd pack up my things and head to the community center for my classes. I'd started with one session a week, basic budgeting, credit repair, the small steps no one teaches young adults until it's too late. Now 3 days a week, I stood in front of a room full of people taking back control of their lives the same way I had. One afternoon, a young woman stayed after class. Her name was Lila. She reminded me of myself, at 22, shoulders, tense voice, careful hope buried under apology. She told me she'd been helping her parents pay their mortgage for years, covering bills whenever they forgot. She whispered that she was tired, but didn't know how to stop without feeling cruel. I handed her a notepad and said, "Write down what's yours to carry and what isn't. You'll be surprised how little belongs on your side." She looked at me for a long moment before nodding. When she left, she hugged me and said I didn't think anyone would understand. After she walked out, I sat for a while in the quiet classroom sunlight slanting across the whiteboard. I thought about how pain, when spoken honestly, becomes something you can hand to someone else without losing yourself in it. Maybe that was the real inheritance I'd been meant to protect, the chance to give what my grandmother wanted for all of us: stability, courage, and the ability to choose kindness without surrender. By fall, the house began to fill with the scent of baked apples and rain. Laura brought over pies and stories. Thomas fixed a loose step on the porch. They never asked for explanations, never treated me like something broken. Their presence taught me that love can be quiet and still mean everything. On weekends, James and I would drive out to the lake with thermoses of coffee. We'd sit in the car with the windows cracked, watching fog lift off the water. Sometimes we talked about the future travel, maybe opening a second community class in another town. But mostly, we sat in silence, comfortable in the way shared peace feels. One Sunday afternoon, as the wind pressed softly against the car windows, James asked, "Do you ever think you'll talk to them again?" I took a long breath before answering. "Maybe one day," I said. But it would have to be a new conversation. Not about guilt or debt or old promises, just people meeting as equals. He nodded his fingers, finding mine on the center console. "You don't owe them an answer," he said. "I know," I replied, watching the ripples stretch across the water. "But I do owe myself honesty. That's enough." Back home, the answering machine light blinked once, just one new message. I pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the kitchen. She spoke slowly the way she always did when trying to sound calm. "I hope you're well," she said. "We're fine here. Your father's been quiet. I just wanted you to know we're thinking of you." There was a pause, then the faint sound of her sigh. "Take care of yourself, Natalie. That was all. No request, no anger, no manipulation. Just a few words hanging in the air." I stood still, listening to the silence that followed. Then I reached out and pressed delete. It wasn't anger that moved my hand. It was peace. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting lines of gold across the floor. I brewed coffee and stepped outside, barefoot, the porch wood warm against my feet. The world smelled of dew and fresh-cut grass. Across the street, Mrs. Garcia was watering her geraniums. She waved, and I waved back. The simplicity of that moment, the neighborly greeting, the light breeze lifting the hem of my robe, felt like proof that peace doesn't come as a grand arrival. It comes quietly like morning. When I went back inside, James was at the stove making breakfast. He turned spatula in hand and grinned. "You're smiling before coffee. Should I be worried?" "Maybe," I said, laughing. "I think I'm happy." He slid a plate onto the table and said, "You should get used to that." Later that week, I gathered old files and records into a single box, the remnants of everything that had once bound me to chaos. I labeled it "Closed Accounts" and carried it to the attic. As I slid it onto the shelf, dust rose in the sunlight like tiny flecks of gold. I didn't feel the need to seal it or lock it away. Just knowing it was there, quiet and contained, was enough. By the end of the year, the community center asked if I'd consider developing a scholarship fund for students completing my program. The irony didn't escape me, a fund this time, built on transparency and hope instead of guilt. I accepted naming it after my grandmother, the Hayes Initiative for Financial Renewal. The first recipient, a single mother named Teresa, wrote me a thank you note. She said, "You didn't just give me help, you showed me it's okay to start over." Reading her words, I thought about how everything I'd lost had made space for this kind of purpose. That was the quiet victory I never saw coming, the way life can turn pain into usefulness when you stop feeding it resentment. One evening, as twilight deepened, I lit a single candle on the kitchen table. Outside, the air was cool and still. I watched the flame bend and straighten, casting soft light over the room. For years, I'd chased love like a flickering light that kept slipping away. Now, it lived here, steady, warm, unremarkable, in the best possible way. Peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the presence of understanding. And as the night deepened, I realized something simple but true. Some wounds don't heal because we forgive. They heal because we stop reopening them. If this story found something familiar in your heart, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever had to rebuild your peace from the ground up, know that you're not alone. Like, share, and subscribe if these stories remind you that quiet strength is still strength, and that peace, once chosen, is yours to keep.